Hello and welcome to this class. This is Module 8 for Educational Psychology. My name is Dr. Neil Soggie. Within this module, we will be taking a look at education in a living context, and primarily we're going to focus in on communication within this class. Now, there's a great little quote from Franklin Roosevelt, that goes like this: be sincere, be brief, be seated. Now, Franklin Roosevelt was a former president of the United States, and he advised being brief and sincere when communicating. In advising to be seated, he was being somewhat more indirect. Perhaps he was suggesting that conversation and dialogue would be improved by reducing the power difference between individuals. If so, he was giving some good advice, though perhaps it was also a bit misleading in its simplicity. Now, as teachers, we face almost continual talk at school, supplemented by ample amounts of non-verbal communication, gestures, facial expressions, and other body language. And often the talk involves many people at once, or even an entire class, and individuals that have to take turns, speaking while also listening to others having their turns, or sometimes ignoring the others if a conversation does not concern them. Now, as the teacher, therefore, you find yourself playing an assortment of roles when communicating in the classroom. You are both the master of ceremonies, you're the referee, and of course, a source of new knowledge. Your challenge is to sort out these roles so that you can play the right one in the right combination at the right time. And be patient with yourself. That will take time. One simple rule, though, is this: listen. Listening can be extremely powerful. And the general rule is you have 2 ears and 1 mouth. Listen more than you talk. And the important thing here is you're giving your students voice. And when you give your students voice, they discover the joy of taking the information in, processing it, and then expressing it. And it's that full loop that really consolidates the learning within the child. So be mindful of that as you go forward. Now, communication in classrooms is somewhat different than it is in other places. It's very complex. It's much more complex than talking to just one person. So it helps to think of the challenge as a problem in communication, or to think of it in terms of who says what to whom and with what effect. In classrooms, things often do not happen at an even pace or in a logical order, or with just the teacher and the student interacting. There's always multiple interactions. There's a bit of a kaleidoscope of interactions that are going on. There's interactions, there's disruptions, there's decisions that need to be made, and all of this needs to be managed through the process. Now, classrooms are different from many other group situations in that communication serves a unique combination of 3 purposes at once. It provides content, it provides procedures, and it provides behavioral control. Now, when we think in terms of content talk, we're focusing in on what is being learned. It happens when a teacher or student states or asks about an idea or a concept. Usually, content talk relates in some obvious way to the curriculum or to the current learning objectives within the class. But content talk can also digress from the current learning objectives in order to clarify something else. Then there's procedural talk. And as it implies, it's about administrative rules or routines that are needed to accomplish tasks in the classrooms. And it generally keeps activities organized and flowing smoothly. Procedural talk is not primarily about removing or correcting unwanted behavior, although certain administrative procedures might sometimes annoy a particular student, or a student might sometimes forget to follow a procedure. Instead, procedural talk is intended to provide the guidance that students need to coordinate with each other and with the teacher. And then there's control talk, and that's about preventing or correcting misbehaviors when they occur, particularly when the misbehaviors are not because of ignorance of procedures. It happens when students do something that they desire but that has negative impacts on other people. Its purpose is, by definition, to influence or control inappropriate behavior. And so sometimes it can be a little confusing. What's procedural? What's control? The rule is that procedural helps to coordinate classroom dialogue. Now, it may also control inattentive behavior, and that double function can sometimes be confusing. But a student may hear only the content or procedural function of a teacher's comment and miss an implied request or command to change inappropriate behavior. So sometimes it's good to simply focus upon the behavior in order to change it. Now, when we talk about communication, we need to be mindful that there are different ways of communicating. There's verbal and non-verbal communication, as well as unintended and intended forms of communication. Now, obviously, we have verbal communication, and that is a message or information expressed in words, either orally or in writing. Now, classrooms obviously have lots of verbal communication. It happens every time a teacher explains a bit of content, asks a question, or writes information or instructions on a board. And then there's non-verbal communication, which are gestures or behaviors that convey information, often simultaneously with spoken words. Now, whether you're dealing with verbal or non-verbal, however, classroom communication often conveys more meaning than is intended. There can be unintended communication, where there are excess meanings in an utterance. And they are messages received by students without the teacher's awareness or the teacher's desire. And so you just need to be mindful that sometimes that can happen. Now, it's important, because we are dealing with a public setting and we need to be careful to be deliberate with our communication. There needs to be a priority on having a characteristically business-like style of teacher talk. There needs to be a professional way of speaking. And we'll look at that a little bit later on, but the important thing is to remember that we need to avoid misunderstandings that may result from poor communication. So it's important to be clear in your verbal communication, in your nonverbal communication, but be mindful for unintended meanings. And so it's always important to check in with the person. to find out what they heard versus what you said. Now, when we are talking about verbal communication, communicating effectively requires using all forms of classroom talk in a combination appropriate for the particular utterances and their particular interactions. And in various places, there are appropriate times for different strategies within talk. Now, one thing that is important is that we need to communicate content within our talk. And that's an obvious instructional strategy that needs to be part of the process. So we need to have effective content within our talk. Now, in addition to communicating about content, teachers need to communicate procedures and expectations about appropriate classroom behavior. And there are quite a few ways of communicating with students about these matters. Now, we've talked a little bit about this with classroom management, and we'll talk about it in other modules as well. But procedural and control talk really are important parts of the whole process of engaging with a person. Now, when we talk in terms of nonverbal communication, while words are important, words are not the only way that teachers and students communicate. There are gestures and behaviors that convey information as well. And often these support the teacher's words, but sometimes they contradict each other. And students and teachers can express themselves non-verbally in all their conversations, and it's important to have congruence between the words and the gestures. So be mindful of what you are communicating in non-verbal communication. For example, be mindful to provide eye contact. Eye contact, which is the extent and timing of when a speaker looks directly into the eyes of the listeners. In conversations between friends of equal status, for example, most native English speakers will look directly at the speaker when listening, but to avert their gaze when speaking. Now, re-engaging eye contact signals that a speaker is about to finish a turn and is inviting a response from the listener. So be mindful of how you use eye contact. Then there's wait time. Another important nonverbal behavior is wait time, which is the pause between conversation turns. Wait time marks when a conversation the speaking of one person ends and the speaking of the other can begin. If a teacher asks a question, for example, the wait time both allows and prompts students to formulate an appropriate response. And you can be patient with that. Don't be afraid of an awkward pause now and again. And then there is social distance. When two people interact, the physical space or distance between them, their social distance, often indicates something about how intimate or personal their relationship is. Social distance affects how people describe others and their actions. Someone who is habitually is more physically distant is apt to be described in more general terms, in more abstract terms, than someone who is physically distant. The average distance within North American society is about 0.5 meter to 1 meter. That is the comfortable social distance space. Any closer than that, and it seems to cause anxiety within people. Any farther away than 1 meter, and the person seems to feel distant. So be mindful of social distance as well within your talk with people. Then there is the structure of participation. You want to have social participation within your class. How do you do that? Many activities take on patterns that guide communication in ways that class members learn to expect, often without even being reminded of this. Each pattern is a participation structure, a set of rights and responsibilities expected from students and teachers during an activity. Sometimes the teacher announces or explains the rights and responsibilities explicitly, though often they are just implied by the actions of the class members, or individual students learn them simply by watching each other. Now, there are lots of different ways of conveying content, of dealing with and struggling with information. One is lecturing. Lecturing is where the teacher talks and the student listens. Maybe the student takes notes, maybe they don't. Then there's questions and answers. The teacher asks a series of questions, calling on one student at a time to answer each of them. Students raise their hands to be recognized and give answers that are brief and ideally correct. Now, in earlier times, this participation structure was sometimes called recitation. Then there is discussion. And here the teacher briefly describes a topic or problem and invites students to comment on it. Students say something relevant about the topic, but also are supposed to respond to previous speakers in as much as possible. And then there's my favorite, group work. And group work is where the teacher assigns a general task, a general topic, and a small group of students work out the details of implementing it. The teacher may check in from time to time on the group's progress before they finish, but that isn't necessary. All of these are ways of engaging the students in communicating and in dealing with the content in a social way, where everyone is engaged, everyone is dealing with the content and learning how to work together. That is the important thing that I want you to be mindful of within the issue of participation and communication. Now, we need to remember that there are different communication styles within the classroom. Teachers and students have identifiable styles of talking. And this is something that linguists will call a register. And a register is a pattern of vocabulary, grammar, and expressions or comments that a person associate with a social role. Now, we're all familiar with the baby talk register, which we use to speak to an infant. There are different types of registers, and we just need to be mindful of them as we speak with people. Now, a little bit about how teachers talk. Although teachers' talk varies somewhat based upon the task or purpose at hand, it also has uniformities that occur across a range of situations. Using detailed observations of discourse in science activities, for example, a teacher can identify all of the strategies for observation within a classroom talk. And each strategy simultaneously influences the course discussion and focuses the student's attention. And in these ways, it helps indirectly to ensure appropriate classroom behavior. Some of these strategies are nominating, terminating, and interrupting speakers. Teachers often choose who gets to speak. On the other hand, they often bring an end to a student's turn at speaking or even interrupt the student before the student finishes. And that's part of the role of being a teacher. You need to manage your time and keep the discussion on task as much as possible. It's also important for the teacher to indicate that an idea is important. Or, on the other hand, the teacher sometimes indicates that an idea is not crucial or not necessary within a given sphere. The teacher also declares when an activity is over and a new activity is starting. So that's signaling the boundaries between activities. A teacher can also ask test questions and evaluating questions. A teacher can ask a question and evaluate the quality and correctness of the student's answers. And that helps the teacher to discover whether or not the student is on task or not, and whether they're in that zone of proximal development that we're always looking for. Then there's an exaggerated change in pitch. When busy teaching, teachers tend to exaggerate changes in the pitch of their voice. A bit of a sing-along style that adults sometimes use. And by exaggerating the pitch changes, it accentuates things, particularly for younger students. It's also important to use careful enunciation. In classroom teachers, they will tend to speak more slowly and clearly and carefully than they would in an informal conversation. And this style makes a speaker sound somewhat formal, but it is valuable in this context. This also means that the teacher will be setting up a professional way of speaking. So this is part of the professionalism. A touch of formality makes the teacher sound intelligent and gives an air of professionalism to the relationship between the teacher and the student. You want to have a good connection with the student, but there also needs to be a professional boundary. And by having clear, formal vocabulary and grammar, you are adding a sense of professionalism to your role as teacher. Now, how do students talk? That's going to depend whether they're children or youth. They will use the characteristic speech register with that corresponds with their development. Their register, their student talk, is going to differ somewhat from the teachers because obviously there's a difference in knowledge level, there's a difference in role, there's a difference in responsibility, there's a difference in the relationship. Student talk and teacher talk, though, are similar in that they both involve language strategies that guide content and procedures, and that sometimes seek to limit the inappropriate behavior of the other. Now, some things that students will do. Sometimes students interrupt the discussion to ask about or remind others, and especially the teacher, of an agreed upon agenda. So that is what we call agenda enforcement on the part of the student. The student wants to ensure that the rules that have been established are abided by. And this is the student keeping the teacher accountable. There can also be digression attempts. Now, during a discussion or activity, a student asks a question or makes a statement that is not relevant to the task at hand. Most oftentimes, they will talk about another class or they will talk about another assignment, and that will pull people off task. There's also side talk, where one student talks to another just to be social or to get information that they need. There's also calling out. where a student speaks out of turn without being recognized by the teacher. Now, the student's comment may or may not be relevant to the ongoing task or topic, and the teacher may or may not acknowledge or respond to it. But whether you ignore it or not, just be mindful that it can influence all the other students. So you need to be able to manage this in an appropriate way. And you'll find the balance for that as you go on teaching. Now, when we are using classroom talk, we need to always be looking at stimulating thinking. These various features of classroom talk characterize the communication of most teachers and students, at least when they're in the classroom and they're doing assignments. But there's a variability, obviously, between grades, between curricula, and between teachers and between students. The things that we need to be mindful of, though, is that we are always looking for moving the student forward. And part of that is probing for learner understanding. So how do you know whether a student understands what you are saying? One clue, of course, is by whether the student is looking at and concentrating on you and your comments. But this clue isn't foolproof. We've all had those moments of staring at a speaker while we're daydreaming, only to realize that we haven't really heard anything that the teacher is saying. So it's sometimes important to probe more actively how much students are actually understanding during the lesson. So calling upon students to respond can be a good way to do that. We also need to help the students to articulate their ideas and thinking. And the Classroom Talk Register is well designed to help students articulate ideas and thoughts, particularly when used in the context of discussion. In addition to the conversational probes, like the ones that I just mentioned, there are other ways to support students in expressing their ideas fully and clearly. One way is for the teacher to check repeatedly on the understanding of the student's contribution. So inviting students to articulate, and then the teacher rephrasing a comment made by the student, or a teacher comparing the student's idea to another related idea, and ask for the student to comment on that and have a bit of a conversation about what is going on. And then, of course, there is promoting academic risk-taking and academic problem solving. And here we're interested in working backwards from the beginning and looking at analogical thinking. It's important to allow students to take risks at formulating solutions to problems. What a teacher says or does should be supportive of the student taking a risk and trying to formulate what is going on. So it's important here to, wherever possible, emphasize the learning, emphasize the problem solving, and minimize the importance of grades. We want to encourage students to be mindful that the end goal is knowledge and learning and transformation. It isn't the grades. The grades are serving a function, but that is not the ultimate goal. And it's also important to make sure that students are aware that they have ample time to complete an activity and to continually invite the student to engage in the activity so that there is a continual safe space for for the student to engage in the process. And this brings us to the core of communication. The core of communication within the classroom is about creating a caring community, a safe community. A student will not learn if they do not feel safe. A student engages when they feel that there is a chance for success in a safe environment. So a caring community is one in which all members have a respected place, where diversity among individuals is expected and it is accepted, and in which individuals assist each other with their work and their activities wherever that's appropriate. Classrooms and even entire schools can be caring communities. And this happens through moving them towards the direction of working with each other and respecting each other. And with that comes communication. Communication is part and parcel of that process. When conflicts arise between students or between a student and a teacher, it's important to encourage respectful communication as explicitly as you can. Some communication strategies are essential. You can identify ownership of the problem. You can practice active listening. You can use I statements. You can use negotiation. In all of these things, the bottom line is communication. The message has been sent, and it's important for the sender of the message to invite a response from the individual that the message is sent to find out how that message has been reconstructed, to ensure that accurate transmission of information has been sent. That is the bottom line. And the goal is a caring community where students can learn. And that's it for our class this week. See you next week. Bye-bye.